Nesta era de crise econômica no Brasil e no mundo, predominam as propostas de solução por meio de uma linha liberal e ortodoxa, que prega o equilíbrio das contas públicas, o controle do déficit fiscal e a redução da dívida pública. Constituem a premissa básica, segundo essa escola econômica, para tranquilizar o setor privado e assim gerar investimentos de empresas e indivíduos para a felicidade geral da nação. O Estado não precisa ser letárgico, diz a economista ítalo-americana Mariana Mazzucato, que aponta no setor público um agente potencial de criatividade e inovação. Assim ocorre, diz ela, e aí surpreende mais ainda, no templo da economia de mercado, nos Estados Unidos. Segundo Mazzucato, o setor público americano é o responsável por inovações que depois passam ao setor privado e correm mundo com a fama de terem sido inventadas por particulares. Exemplo mais claro, diz ela, é a empresa Apple, cujas inovações principais teriam saído, diz ela, de pesquisas no setor público, sobretudo militar. O Vale do Silício, na Califórnia, paradigma da inovação na era da informática, cresceu e se nutriu da corrida espacial americana, financiada pelo Estado, via NASA. Tirou benefício também do empenho paralelo do Ministério da Defesa americano em desenvolver mísseis balísticos e outras armas de componentes eletrônicos complexos e minúsculos, adaptados depois ao uso civil. At the request of the Brazilian government, you have prepared this report about the importance of innovation for the Brazilian economy, your area of expertise. How can Brazil consider innovation now when the country is going through such dire straits in the economy?
Well, I think it's especially now that it should be thinking about lifting its eyes beyond its internal problems. And what we know, just looking internationally, is that it tends to be investment-led and innovation-led growth that allows economies not only to recover, but to have long-standing growth. And so, especially in a country which is undergoing a recession, let's forget whether it occurred because of political or economic reasons, there's currently a recession in Brazil, thinking about how to actually stimulate private and public investment is absolutely key. So Keynes was very good on this, right? So Keynes talked about the importance of counter-cyclical spending. So you don't want to be pro-cyclical during a bust. You don't cut, you increase. But he also, I think, talked about how it's also important to think big. So not just digging ditches and filling them up again, bridges and roads, but what can the state capacity, when it actually has a view of how to transform an economy, how can it do that? And so I think the point of innovation-led policy is to allow a direction for investment.
These kinds of investments that you suggest for innovation cost public money in the short term, but in the long term increase competitiveness and GDP. But how can you do that when the government is trying to cut costs instead?
Right. Well, first of all, let's just start with the facts, which is that the debt to GDP ratio in Brazil is very modest. This might come as a surprise to most of the people who might be watching this show, who've been told over and over again that the public budget is just too big, but it's 60%. That's nothing compared to the UK, which is 90%, the US, which is about 95%, the rest of Europe, which is over 100%. And what we know is that that actual number doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously, when it's way too high, like Greece's, it does matter. But, is it 50, 60, 70, 80, or 90? That's the magic number. That's not the point. The point is what you're actually doing with that public money. You don't want to be wasting it. You don't want to be squandering it. You want to have, if you want strategic ministries, whether it's education, health, innovation, defense, to be working together to transform an economy. And yes, it costs money. But if you think about the debt to GDP ratio, if you're not actually stimulating those kinds of investments that lead to higher productivity and eventually higher GDP growth, then even with a modest deficit, your debt to GDP ratio can actually go to infinity almost. So as long as GDP is staying stagnant, is not growing, take Italy where I'm from, we've had pretty low deficits for the last 15 to 20 years. But very little growth in productivity and very little growth in GDP. Hence, the ratio of debt to GDP has just gone sky high because the denominator is not growing. So then the question is, what do we actually know that increases growth of GDP in the long run? And these are investments in research and development, in human capital, in training and education, but not just throwing money at these areas, also doing it strategically. And this is what we mean also by the necessity to actually increase the capacity, the competence, the capabilities also of government institutions, as well as private sector institutions, in order to think strategically about how to catalyze investments in these different areas and create the partnerships between the public and private sector, which are so crucial.
Suppose you're going to meet President Dilma Rousseff. As you understand now, she's pretty busy with several other topics. So if you don't have much time, you have to summarize to her in a brief encounter. What are you going to tell her about your report?
So how many minutes would I have? No. So, well, first of all, when I was there last, I actually met with her and 7 ministers, including the finance minister, Joachim Levy, who was still there. He has since left. And I was quite surprised by the sort of very positive, if you want, outlook that these 8 different, well, 7 plus Dilma, if you want, different ministers had on the need to actually look again at both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Brazilian innovation system, and looking at, if you want, international studies, learning from international studies about how to move forwards. If I have a little time with her, I mean, the big question is how much time she'll have after I have time with her in terms of being in the government.
Let's assume it's going to be a short time, so you have to summarize.
Yeah.
What do you recommend to her, not to her technical assistant?
I think what she needs to do on the economy, again, forget the political crisis, I'm not a political scientist, is to focus on, the need, obviously, for state capacity to react, and again, as I said before, to have counter-cyclical measures. But instead of just thinking of it as a quantity, a bag full of money that then one sprays across different ministries, to really think strategically about how to increase the capacity of this decentralized network of public institutions in order to foster innovation-led growth. And so the point of our report, it's even in the title, we talk about a mission-oriented innovation policy. And that really is centered around transformational change. So this is not about innovation just going from an iPhone 5 to an iPhone 6 or just focusing on high tech. It's about transforming how all the sectors interact also together, but around challenges, societal or technological problems that the economy might have. And because the economy is having such problems right now, I think that this might just be a breath of fresh air at the right time in a period in Brazil's history where it's so, in some ways, depressed. I mean, yes, there's people in the streets waving their hands a lot, but there's a depression in terms of, say, the future of the country, what actually can be done, given the levels of corruption, given the, if you want, incapacity currently, at least, of Congress to move.
You mentioned that you were there and you saw Minister Joaquim Levy at the time. As you know, he left the position, but now Nelson Barbosa occupies that position. He recently said, the role of government is to stimulate the economy in order to recover income, jobs, and tax revenue. It seems to be pretty much along the lines of what you think as well.
It depends, yes. Well, it depends what one means by that word. So even in the UK where I live, we also talk about stimulating the economy, but then it ends up just being done indirectly, for example, through different types of tax incentives. I very much believe in the need to look at both direct and indirect measures. When we just focus on different types of, say, tax incentives in order to stimulate, we assume that the private sector already wants to invest. What we actually know, again, if you look at history in different countries, but also the history of sectors, is that the private sector only invests when it sees the potential, if you want, growth in a particular market, when they see an opportunity, and their expectations about those opportunities increase. And what we know is that these expectations about future growth possibilities, which can be both technological and market, if you want, opportunities, tend to be highly correlated with direct government spend in a particular area, because the kinds of investments that are often required where the private sector is not investing are in those areas which have high technological and market uncertainty, as well as high capital intensity. And so when we talk about stimulating the economy, it should really be directed at those areas where the private sector is not currently moving, where we have high additionality, meaning making the private sector do what it wouldn't have done anyway. And currently, one of the problems in the Brazilian economy is that it has a very inertial private sector. And it's amazing how little attention is being given to that. Someone once told me that we have capitalism without capitalists in Brazil.
When you talk about inertial, that's usually associated with the state in Brazil. And the state is seen as bureaucratic, lethargic, and incompetent, and only gets in the way of the so-called dynamic sector, which is the private sector. You don't think that's pretty much the reality, or is that more of a myth that the state is necessarily so? Not just in Brazil, but conceptually.
I mean, conceptually, the point. I mean, I wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, which was translated in Brazil as O Estado Empreendedor, which argued precisely against that, if you want, cartoon image of the dynamic, really energetic, creative, thinking out of the box private sector, and the lethargic, dinosaur, bureaucratic, inertial public sector. Because in fact, what we see, again, looking at the evolution of information technology, nanotechnology, biotechnology, aerospace, in some ways was the exact opposite, where we had a pretty creative and dynamic public sector with the private sector entering only later. And unless the partnership between the two becomes a dynamic one, if anything, this, if you want, parasitic relationship, or if you want, a parasitic relationship emerges, which is that the private sector continues to depend on the public sector to do what it eventually actually should be doing. And what's interesting, if we look at history, is that private sector investments often increased when there was proper deals with the government. So, for example, one of the most dynamic private sector research and development laboratories in the US was Bell Labs inside AT&T. And AT&T at the time was a monopoly, and the government forced basically AT&T to reinvest its profits into the real economy innovation, big innovation, in order to retain its monopoly status. What we don't have today are those kinds of healthy deals where we don't just ask government for more, but it comes, if you want, conditionally, based on an increase in private sector investment. And that's a healthy deal. That's not a backroom deal.
Well, the backroom deals is usually thought upon when you consider the government supporting certain companies, national champions, or certain sector subsidizing it. That's considered improper roles.
Right. Well, first of all, the kinds of support that big national champions, say like Embraer, get in Brazil are completely at par with the kind of support that Boeing or Airbus get abroad. So for national champions to compete through innovation, they need state support. Why? Because what innovation requires is not any kind of finance, but patient, long-term, committed finance. And what we have in the whole world, but in some ways even more so in Brazil than some other countries, is a private financial industry interested mainly in gambling, not providing that kind of patient finance to real industry and to innovation. They're incredibly risk-averse, and simply, it's just a fact, have not been a key provider of that kind of finance. Even in the US, private venture capital, for example, which is there precisely to fill that gap. So private banks tend to be much more risk-averse, say, than venture capital, but even venture capitalists have become exit-driven, short-term oriented, wanting their returns in 3 to 5 years, when even the Death Valley phase of the innovation chain, when you actually require venture capital, sometimes can last 10 or 15 years. So if it's not going to come from the public sector, who's going to provide it? Now, in terms of picking specific firms and technologies, which you were hinting at, the example I always give is the iPhone. So every specific technology in the iPhone that makes that phone smart and not stupid was picked. It was picked. So the internet was picked, GPS was picked, Siri was picked, touchscreen display was picked.
What do you mean by picked?
Were chosen through government policies, whether it was through DARPA, which is an innovation agency like FINEP in the Department of Defense, whether it was through the CIA, which actually funded the touchscreen display, or Siri, the voice-activated system where you can talk into your iPhone, that was also funded by DARPA. This was not spreading public money across the board and waiting for miracles to happen. This was very directed. For each one of those investments, so for every successful internet, there's 8 or 9 failures. We know that. Any venture capitalist will tell you that's normal. But precisely because we pretend that the government is just there to level the playing field, as opposed to tilting it in the particular direction of what it wants to be done, we also haven't allowed it to reap back, if you want, a reward for the successes in order to cover the inevitable losses from the failures. One thing that's very interesting in Brazil, but also in China and in Germany, is that you do have a public bank, right? You have BNDES, Germany has KfW, China has the China Development Bank, and these public banks do one thing that the US government hasn't learned, which is precisely to treat the investments as an investment. So perhaps, you know, retaining equity, for example.
For the government.
Well, for the government, for the treasury, for the taxpayer that funds them, right? So I think something like 80% of BNDES's return on equity goes back to the treasury, which then can fund, you know, health, education, whatever, or even give it back, you know, part of it to BNDES to do future investments. I think BNDES only retains 20% of its return that then it can fund again through a revolving fund. That's normal. You know, having a revolving fund is normal for the venture capital sector. Instead, the US has always thought that that return would simply occur through, say, tax. And of course, what's happened to tax around the world is well known. So capital gains tax has fallen immensely. We also have much more opportunities for both tax evasion, tax avoidance, loopholes of all sorts. And it's not clear whether tax alone is enabling public sector agencies to, if you want, reap back some reward for these very high-risk investments.
It's true, but as you find out, the current deficit in Brazil is 10%. Yeah. And people go back to that issue, that with a deficit of that magnitude and the high interest rate in Brazil, you can't really be thinking about government investment. Right. So do you think there's an obsession with public deficit?
Yes, there absolutely is. Well, it's not about the number. So the U.S. had a 10% deficit in 2009 in order to get out of the crisis. And what did it do with that money? I think it was the 800 billion ARA scheme, which ended up giving a lot of that to the Department of Energy, which created a sister organization in the Department of Energy to DARPA in the Department of Defense to really steer the countercyclical stimulus of Obama. So they set up ARPA-E, which is, again, a sister organization to DARPA, but in the Department of Energy. And it's quite clear now that it was precisely those kinds of investments targeted towards renewal of the U.S. economy, which are the causes of the limited growth, if you want, that the U.S. currently is experiencing. I mean, the U.S. is, in fact, getting its act together again. Productivity is rising, jobs are rising. And they're trying to also target the reforms also to particular types of manufacturing, setting up also different intermediary institutions between science and industry, and allowing, if you want, second generation IT. Now, whether or not, the U.S. is actually going to be able to compete, for example, with China, which has actually increased its public R&D in the double digits, whereas the U.S. still now, because of sequestration, is having to, for the first time in its history, cut its public R&D spending in agencies like NASA, NIH, NSF, is remain to be seen. But what's interesting is that this big debate in Brazil about the particular number, or in Europe even worse, where we're trying to run surpluses, just ignores the fact that there is absolutely no empirical evidence economically that 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, that particular number in terms of deficit matters. What we do know is that obviously it can't remain 10% if you want for years and years, but if it's for a period of time where what we're trying to do is to have counter-cyclical investment targeted towards particular areas that we think will increase productivity and long-run growth, that tends to,
But you run into another problem nowadays, that the so-called international ratings agency look at those things. And part of that obsession, perhaps, but they do look at that. And they lower your grade internationally. And then the country cannot borrow money at decent rates because they got bad grades, as it were.
The ratings agencies were actually very much part of the problem. It's very sad, actually, that these types of public institutions, including public banks worldwide, are being limited in their ability to act. For example, even the European Investment Bank has limited its counter-cyclical spending because it wants to retain its AAA rating by agencies which we know are extremely problematic. So let me just say that in terms of the rating agencies. The problem is when there's emphasis just on the static number versus the kind of dynamics that one is trying to foster. And so again, what we definitely need is institutions that will provide this patient, committed finance, whether it's going to come from the private sector or the public sector. I'm happy to remain agnostic. What we currently know in Brazil is there is no real patient finance coming out of the private banking system. So if Brazil simply wants to compete worldwide through, say, an Irish kind of strategy, which is, almost enterprise zone, come here, capital, we have, low tax or whatever, that's one thing. But if it wants to actually compete through innovation and compete by producing the kinds of high quality products and services that the world eventually will buy, then it really needs to think strategically about its industrial strategy, its innovation policy, and how to become competitive. And this has never happened. There's simply no historical evidence whatsoever that it's ever happened without a strategic public sector working alongside the private sector. So it would be wonderful if we could have a pause and we could actually have discussions between small, medium, large companies in Brazil and different types of public sector institutions in Brazil, and how to work together in creative, dynamic ways in the future, and just shift the conversation. Carry out your corruption procedures, fine. Obviously, that needs to be sorted, but let's look up a minute and think about what are the new societal and technological challenges that the country can face with the dynamic network of different public and private actors.